This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. This week, we're going to talk about the unintended consequences of USP compliance as it relates to construction of compounding facilities. And as many of you may know, implementation of the 2019 final version of USP 800 is not currently being enforced by many states. But quite a few pharmacies around the country are either in the planning and budgeting stages or have already moved forward with construction and are being compliant with these USP 800 standards. So here to talk about the impacts regulatory changes may have on the facilities, as well as the necessary planning to consider in building new or renovating existing facilities, is Bryan Prince. Welcome, Bryan. Great to have you with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me. I certainly appreciate you letting me join in and talk about this subject that's certainly near and dear to my heart.
Absolutely. We're excited to have you. This is quite a different slant for us in terms of what we normally talk about in the compounding space, but a very important topic, as you know, compounders routinely find reasons that they need to either update their facility or make some changes to their clean rooms, et cetera. And this is some welcome guidance on that. So I do appreciate it. Bryan, let's dive right in. I want to ask you about the unintended consequences that we alluded to in the show title here. What consequences are you encountering during design, planning, and construction?
Yeah, that is really the crux of what I do as a lab design consultant, really helping to kind of deconstruct and demystify what is USP 800. And when I started on this journey 5-6 years ago, that layer of onion that which we would joke at various conferences. I spoke at a lot of conferences. We would joke about how it was a layered onion, which was USP 800. And as we unravel it, what I have found is that the unintended consequence really lies within the construction phase of this, right? Because now, if you look at Table 2 and Table 3 within the chapter of USP 800, it says that the CSEC, the containment secondary engineering control, which is the compounding room, the hazardous drug compounding room, must be externally vented. So what does that mean? What that means is that we're actually going to be pumping perfectly good air out of a building, and then we've got to replace that air. Well, what we're finding is that a lot of facilities, whether they're independent community compounding pharmacies, whether they're infusion pharmacies, or whether they're hospital pharmacies, getting air out of a building is not always the easiest thing, especially think about a hospital who, where's the pharmacy located on a 7-story building? It's always on the first floor. And so you can imagine trying to get an exhaust stack out of the building. And then the other, for community pharmacies and infusion pharmacies, they're having to determine, all right, what are the new electrical needs that we're going to need? Because if you throw air out of a building, and I say throw, you externally vent per USP 100 air out of a building, you've got to replace that air. It is a 1-to-1 ratio. And so that requires new mechanical equipment. Well, a new piece of mechanical equipment that does that 100% outdoor air conditioning of those temperatures and humidities that we need specific to the clean rooms, that's a dedicated piece of equipment. And your minimum buy-in could be $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. I've seen the numbers just go astronomical. And so I don't know that when the USP expert committee was putting this together, and I'm not going to beat them up too much, but when they say, well, what would be our best path here? Well, externally venting the air from a hazardous drug room. That means there's no opportunity for recirculation of potentially contaminated air going back into an air handling system, contaminating the mechanical equipment. Great, I get that. But what does that look like from an impact perspective on the financial side? And so that's really where the unintended consequences. So I've got a great story where one of my clients, this is probably about 2 years ago, she calls me, she says, hey, Bryan, I've seen you speak at a lot of different conferences and I really appreciate all the information. She's like, I just bought this building and I'm ready to go. And I'm ready to hire you as to design it. I'm like, great, I really appreciate that. Well, the building was single story and it was formerly a dental office. Well, why does a dental office not translate to a compounding pharmacy, right? We're both kind of in that medical space. It feels good. It seems good. Well, they only had After we kind of got to digging a little bit, we saw that it only had one 200 amp panel. And what that means is that there's not a lot of electricity to spread around to new mechanical equipment. We needed three-phase. To get three-phase brought in from the city, from whomever, was going to be like another $40,000. The roof structure wouldn't support new mechanical equipment because it was an old wood structure. So we're going to try to put the equipment outside on the ground. Well, the owner of the buildings didn't want a big honking piece of mechanical equipment out on the lawn for other people within that development to see.
Right.
It was just there was so many things that riddled this, and so flash forward a year later, that building is now up for sale again, and so she's now having to go and research and find a new facility, a new building, work with another broker, because what she did not do, what a lot of people don't do kind of up front, is qualify whether or not we've got sufficient electrical, sufficient mechanical, sufficient structural, sufficient, and they're jumping into these real estate deals thinking it's going to work for them. But there are a lot of unintended financial consequences with USP 800 that I don't think that you're not going to find that within the 22 pages, which is the chapter of USP 800.
Well, right, because they're going to tell you what you need to do to keep, your clean room clean, and how to be compliant, and boost patient safety and all of those good things, but they don't really give you the roadmap about how to do that and what you need to be on the lookout for. And those are some great points that you just made. All of those items that you just listed off are probably not at the top of the list for most compounding pharmacists when they're thinking about compounding drugs and meeting patient needs and the safety of hazardous chemicals or whatever, but they're obviously equally important in making all of that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll take this just one step further and talk about that financial side, because that maybe that impact didn't sound so harsh. Well, anytime you implement new mechanical or new electrical equipment into a building, a lot of times you've got to pull what's called a building permit. To get to the building permit phase, I've got to hire an architect who can stamp a set of drawings. Then they want to bring in the mechanical engineer because there's now new HVAC equipment and they want to stamp a set of drawings. Well, I've got to bring in a new electrical panel. So now an electrical engineer has to stamp a set of drawings. And every one of those folks, when they stamp a set of drawings, that could be $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. So now you've got $20,000+ in a set of blueprints just to submit to the city, just to get a building permit, just to upgrade your compounding pharmacy. So you see, there's that layer just kind of keeps going. And I don't mean to, belabor it too much, but there's a lot of layers to the construction process with USP 800 and even 797.
It absolutely sounds like it. And they're all things that need to be considered before you purchase property, or do anything that's, undoable with a pretty easily, like selling a property to buy another one. That's just more than she bargained for, I would bet. Yep. So talking a little bit more about USP 800, I've read that some of the most complex aspects of compliance have turned out to be maintaining the room's pressure. And this probably is related to the airflow you were talking about and proper ventilation. And even prefabricated compounding rooms were experiencing pressure leakages and weren't sufficient to meet this new standard. So I want to see what your insights are, or give us some feedback on your thoughts to the factors surrounding this particular issue.
Yeah, great question. A lot of times I spent a lot of time on Zoom talking with architects and engineers, general contractors, plumbers, electricians, helping them all understand, kind of speaking the same language and moving in the same direction. And one of the things that I say a lot is that the integrity of the envelope is everything. And what that means is that if we're not building tight rooms, yes, we could get pressure leakage. And in the positive pressure, that's not such a big deal because it's non-hazardous and we expect some leakage, and we're also free-flowing air around doors. We expect that. But on the negative pressure side, now we've got a different thing going on where actually if that envelope is not tight, we could be pulling in contaminated air from an interstitial space above the ceiling. And we all know that's very dirty. And so then our bacteria counts, our CFUs, our environmental monitoring, there's so many things that are really happening around that process. And it's funny, I was having this conversation yesterday with what's called a test and balance contractor. When you implement that new mechanical equipment, you have to have it balanced for the space. And this is the person that comes in and they say, okay, tell me about your pressure gradients. We say, okay, it's 0.02 inches plus on the positive side. And then on the negative side, it's negative 0.01 inches to 0.03 inches, which is 2/100ths of a decimal place. Landing these numbers within 2/100ths of a decimal place on the negative side, accounting for leakage, and then on the positive side, and we're free flowing, eventually the pressure bubbles. And somebody told me one time, and this is a really great example. Imagine you've got a clean room suite that has, the ante room, maybe a prep room. It's got a negative buffer. It's got a positive buffer. Imagine a bunch of water balloons inside of a glass jar, and they all dynamically are influencing and affecting each other. So imagine if you put a pinhole in one of the little balloons, it starts to affect the pressurization of the other one. So these test and balance contractors, and I spent an hour yesterday on the phone with one trying to say, okay, what about this damper? What about this fan filter unit? What about this low wall exhaust? And then also, yes, we're free flowing. Part of these problems that test and balance contractor was having was because the envelope was not tight enough. Maybe they didn't caulk the ceilings. Maybe they didn't caulk the ceiling grid. Maybe they didn't clamp down the tiles. Maybe they used a paperback tile instead of a gypsum back tile. We didn't create enough compression. And I know it's impossible to think submarine hatch, but I will oftentimes use that terminology to general contractors is you need to kind of think submarine hatch, right? Anything that can be caulked and sealed needs to be caulked and sealed. Now, what I have found is that prefabricated rooms actually are tighter than stick frame. But again, some people would probably debate that, whether it's epoxy or FRP or other surfaces. But there are some modular wall companies out there that do a phenomenal job at making sure their products lock together. And if not, when we do a final punch through list before we, get the certificate of occupancy, we say, okay, let's start caulking everything. We caulk light boxes and fixtures and stuff like that, so that we've created a tight envelope. So when I hear that pharmacies or compounding pharmacies or clean rooms are having pressurization issues, it never surprises me because there's a lot of moving parts.
Right. Yeah, no, and that makes total sense. And I love the submarine analogy because we can all imagine pinhole leak, and that is not going to have a good result.
Yeah, but enough pinholes compounded on top of each other create
for sure.
a leak in a sinking boat.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That was exactly my point. So it sounds like, a lot of compounding facilities or compounders are going to be facing some challenges with these updated regulations. And I want to ask you to talk a little bit more about the obstacles and what pharmacies can do to overcome them.
Yeah, well, I would say first, don't jump feet first into the program and hire contractors to come and start slinging epoxy paint and stuff like that. Planning is really the biggest part of it. And what I have found is that most pharmacists and pharmacy owners are willing to do the planning up front. And the reason why is, can you imagine what their number one question is? And I'll make this dramatic pause. Their number one question is how much is this going to cost? Because what are the top three concerns of an entrepreneur every day? It's cash flow, cash flow, cash flow.
Right.
And now you're telling me, or I've heard, looking at other chat boards or Facebook groups or whatever it is, I've heard that this thing's going to get expensive, right? A $30,000 air handling unit. And so really now we're coming to a point where some of the pre-planners have gotten the information out there, but I would say the way that you overcome is you start planning it now. You start having preliminary conversations with lab designers, with consultants, with modular wall companies, with HVAC people, and make sure that everybody conceptualizes. Now, what we're also finding is that there's not a lot of HVAC contractors, we also call them mechanical contractors out there in the market, who have done a lot of rooms with multiple pressure bubbles, because it can be a little bit of a mess. And so we're spending a lot of time coaching these folks and how to really assemble what is a USP compliant clean room with all that mechanical stuff. But you've got to kind of cull these out. This is the advice going back to your question, that you've got to cull out some of these people. They go, and I've had contractors go, I'm not your person. I don't want anything to do with these smooth, impervious, free from cracks and crevices and non-shedding surfaces and all this crazy. That's not my deal. And I would rather a general contractor bail out of it and tell me up front, instead of some of the situations that I have got in where they go, oh, yeah, I can do anything. Because that's what contractors want to tell you. Whatever the project is, they can do it. They need the work. They want the work, even if it's not in their wheelhouse. And if you haven't properly qualified some of these folks, and the budget is going to balloon. I tell my clients, my pharmacy clients all the time, here's the evil thing about construction, because I've been in it my entire life in some form or fashion. it never finishes on time and never finishes on budget.
Right. Right.
So I have seen projects that went from, say, let me just throw out numbers like from $750,000 on the complete project to go up to 1.2, 1.4 million, almost doubling the size of the budget because of what we call scope gap or misunderstandings. So it is super, super important to make sure that everybody's on the same page, speaking the same language and moving in the same direction to avoid scope gap and budget creep. Those are your construction terms for today.
So important. Absolutely. And I think anybody that's even done a home renovation project, you know, and hired out for that has experienced this to a lesser extent. So, I mean, can understand how that happens, and it happens quickly sometimes. Are you seeing or hearing or getting requests from individuals that have facilities already, but now they need to be updated to better comply with USP 800's, you know, new release? And what are you doing there?
I can almost say that it's about a 50-50 split between remodels versus new construction. Remodels get a little bit sketchy because what you have to do is you have to say, okay, how do we not disrupt your business model while you're going through this? Now, on the 800 non-sterile side, you know, they're doing powders and hormones and topicals and stuff like that. It's a little bit easier because we're still operating under USP 795 that basically says that you can still do non-sterile compounding on a bench top. Now, obviously, we would never recommend that. We'd always recommend a hood.
Right.
But USP 795 is kind of given this open wild, I say wild west. That's probably a bad way to describe it. But so non-sterile is easier to back into from a remodeling project because you can kind of displace that effort. Now, clean rooms, it gets a lot more sticky, right? Because, and this happened at a hospital. I'm doing a hospital project, and I said, okay, tell me about your scripts. Is everything immediate use, 12-hour BUD, or refrigerated up to 24 hours? Because that would be what we would call a segregated compounding area, which means as long as your patients have immediate use, or you can somehow change your workflow model, then we can build a small segregated compounding area somewhere else to be temporary. But when we're talking about a full-blown clean room, it's hard to just kind of dismantle a piece of a pressure bubble to work on the other pieces of the pressure bubble without migrating, and this is a big thing, without migrating contaminants, because construction in every form or fashion, you got construction guys that are coming in, and we probably didn't put them in Tyvek suits, so they've got dirty boots and dirty gloves, and we just got to be careful about kind of displacing those efforts. But it is somewhat difficult to displace a clean room as a temporary junction in a remodel. It's almost like that needs to be somewhat of a new construction type effort.
Gotcha. Yeah, it sounds like it'd be really hard to do that without some downtime, for sure.
Absolutely.
So, you know, I'm hearing you say that the design and planning phase for USP 800 could potentially take quite a bit of time and effort. So what is the expectation for the timeline, and when should a pharmacy start thinking about the design and planning?
Well, I would kind of say yesterday, if I could say that. There are some state boards of pharmacy out there, like Arizona is one in particular. They say they'll go to you and say, listen, we're not enforcing USP 800 right now, but we want you, but next time we come around, we want to see that you've got a plan. We've got some paper drawings, maybe we've got a budget, we've got some business cards of some GCs. Like, what does that actually look like from a planning perspective? Well, that could actually take 4 weeks to 4 months is really what that planning phase. So let's say that you're a hybrid model pharmacy, independent community compounding pharmacy. And a hybrid model means that we do traditional scripts, retail scripts, as well as compounded scripts.
Right.
And compounding, and I had a gentleman tell me this, I was speaking at the Virginia Board of Virginia State Pharmacy meeting, and he said, I'm what I would call compounding light. Do I have to do all this stuff? And I'm like, well, first of all, explain to me what compounding light means. He's like,
exactly.
90% of my business is traditional retail prescriptions, and then less than 10%-ish would be compounding. And so the answer is, for him, remodeling in his timeline looks really easy because he hasn't put a lot of bank, or his business model hasn't gone deep into compounding. So he's going to do one room, one hood, one small exhaust blower. Maybe we find the fresh air to replace it. His project is going to be, 3 months. Mm-hmm. Now, I've got a project that I'm working on out in Arizona right now. And from the design phase until now, where they're finally getting to and get into the building, it's been a full 12 months. Now, this is all aspects of compounding. It's probably, I'm guessing about 1,200 square feet of non-sterile compounding space. It's probably 900 square feet of all the different steriles. And it's just, there's been a lot of moving parts. But they also had a real diversified business model. So we had to account for a lot of different pieces of equipment as well. But that was a 12-month effort. And so you see where I can kind of go from the small independent community pharmacy, say 3 or 4 months, up to a year. But again, both of them up front wanted to know, how much is this going to cost before we start writing checks? You just don't blindly jump into this process.
Of course. Yeah, no. Speak a little bit more for me, about the pros and cons of renovating versus building new. I mean, I've heard you say, you're almost better off building a new facility if you expect to be working during renovations, or if that would be your alternative. But I want to hear more about the pros and cons, and based on the, assuming that you're adding efficiency measures to your space, when would you choose to renovate versus build new, or vice versa?
Yeah, maybe I'll use the compounding light example from the retail pharmacy a moment ago. That would be an easy pros that you're already in the space. You've already got an established, you've been on the corner of 3rd and Main Street or wherever you're located. You've got a good amount of front end patient traffic that's coming in through the front door. There's just that synergy there. And our building owner has also said, we'll work with you, allowing you to make a new penetration on our roof, which is always a problem. Is it going to start leaking for an exhaust or whatever? And so we've kind of worked out some of those details. That's the pros of staying in the existing space. Now, if you're at scale, I don't know how I say at scale, but let's say that you do all aspects of sterile compounding, you do all aspects of non-sterile compounding, and that's both hazardous and non-hazardous. We could be talking up to 7 or 8 different rooms, depending on gowning rooms, anti-rooms, positive rooms, negative rooms, equipment rooms, encapsulation rooms, however your business model works out in that situation, and you have very little front end traffic. Let's say that the majority of your business is actually, we're mailing it out, or we don't have a lot of direct contact with the patient up front, where we're doing, a lot of patient consults. If your building has got some age on it and we don't see how we're going to start to rearrange people, I've got a call center I've got to rearrange, I've got a break room I've got to rearrange, and just moving these pieces, it's going to be too much pain. Having construction workers coming out banging all the time, that's when you really need to consider seeking out a piece of real estate. And I have these conversations because I know that sometimes pharmacists don't want to try to carry a lease on 2 different pieces of real estate at the same time, and making that transition. Well, this lease is not up for 5 years, and then that new piece, they want me to sign one for 10 years. How do I cross over? Now that gets to be real financially sketchy. And so we kind of have to debate some of those things. But I would say that, keeping in mind that I've got to get new rooftop equipment, new mechanical equipment, and my business is in a growth model. Maybe that's a thing you look at as well, is that if I look at the past, and one of the things I always do up front is, tell me about your business, right? It's great that you've got a 20 by 10 space, but I want to know first about your business. And let's look backwards 2 to 5 years to where we are today. And then let's think about the projection of the next 2 to 5 years. I don't want to build a pharmacy or design a pharmacy for today's business model. I want to base it on where you think the business model is going to go, right? Yeah. And you say, yeah. So for the past 2 to 5 years, we've been in this pretty good growth model. We've had about 18 to 25% year over year growth. And so in reality, I probably am going to grow out of this space in the next 5 years. Great. Let's start talking about that now to go ahead and move out of that space. So it is really a case by case basis, but the reality, there's a lot of factors we're going to weigh in on. And the business model is really at the core of that decision process to stay or go.
Right. And if you decide to stay and do the renovations, what have you seen, be the necessary items that, pharmacists need to consider to keep their business going while construction is happening? And I mean, it sounds somewhat like if you have a multi-room facility, you can cordon off some areas that are able to stay clean. But what other tactics or suggestions do you have?
Yeah, if you're going to stay in that space, with the contractors have got to understand that there cannot be any disruption. And I realize that construction will make noise, but we want to maybe build temporary walls, or at a minimum, mask off that area with heavy plastic, so that their construction particles and all that dust or generated doesn't come into my existing space. There's not a lot of, there's no magic wand here. Construction will disrupt your life. If you've ever, let's say in your home that you were pulling out the old range because you like to get into cooking, so you're putting a new exhaust over your range and we're putting in new cabinets, you will know that remodeling, even in your personal space, is going to disrupt your lifestyle. Well, imagine now you're trying to make drugs for a patient. They're going to disrupt, construction is going to disrupt your lifestyle.
Well, absolutely. But I mean, you still have to make sure, especially if you're sterile compounding, you still have to make sure that you're compliant, right, with all of the regulations, and that ultimately there's no contaminants, there's no unintended particles entering your finished product. So I'm really interested in hearing a little bit more about what you do to help pharmacists overcome that during construction.
Yeah, so what I would, number one, suggest is that your environmental monitoring program. So if you look at, our USP guidelines and our CETA guidelines, we need to have every 6 months, the certifier is going to come in and they're going to put their soy plates down and they're going to do environmental monitoring until if we're growing anything. Well, that's kind of a large window. The 6 month is a big window to not know if you're growing stuff or not. But so I would almost say that, is it time for you to think about buying your own incubator and soy place and doing your own in-house environmental monitoring, especially knowing that I've got construction workers with dirty boots coming through my facility. So yeah, if I'm concerned about sterility, then, do I rent a particle counter? Particle counters are getting just crazy expensive in my opinion. But do you rent one? Do you buy one? Do you do your own environmental monitoring? And I would say all of the above is an absolute yes. If you're going to have construction participating right beside, and USP actually has some things to say about this, about the construction thing, not too much, but you got to know that there's an opportunity that particles are going to migrate. You think, well, my anteroom is at 0.035 inches positive, is pushing all that air out. Yeah, I think you'd be surprised though, especially vapor. The laws of vapor transmission are always opposite. And there could be any number of things that could be migrating into our clean rooms. So I would say, yeah, environmental monitoring, number one, has to go up. That's your first benefit. And then number two, as I said, you got to mask off that area and let people know that they just can't keep walking by the clean room. You don't want unnecessary construction traffic. If that's your main corridor going into the ante room, and that's the main corridor for construction workers, we got to rethink this. Can we route them around the back door? Anything to keep people from walking back and forth in front of my clean room.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure that you spend a lot of time coming up with these temporary fixes, or these fixes to this problem. I'm sure I'm not the first to ask you about that, but I mean, it seems like it's a definite requirement if you're going to continue compounding while you're renovating. So,
yeah, well,
Bryan,
in the very I'm sorry, we've got to make sure that in the very beginning, during that planning phase, we've got the architect on the call, we've got the engineer, the GC, the plumber, we have everybody on the call for the project kickoff. And then even sometimes I've got other projects where they're larger projects, and we do weekly meetings, like every Tuesday at 2 p.m. And we have that open forum. Where projects break down is when communication stops. And so somebody like me, that's what I do, is I keep the communication going to say, okay, what concerns do we have? Because if the GC's flying by himself with no feedback from the owner, client, pharmacy, head tech, whatever you're talking, that communication will break down a project in a skinny minute. So we've got to have everybody on the same page.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Bryan, you have given us certainly a lot to think about today. These are all items which I don't know if they would have necessarily crossed my mind prior to this conversation, and I'm sure our listeners appreciate that too. But before we wrap up, I just want to see what last thoughts or ideas you might like to leave with our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. Understand that the 22-page chapter that is USP 800, it's not disclosing or giving you all the layers, right? So you've got to do some of your own research. You've got to hire people to get on your team. And then I think here's an even bigger one for me is that if an architect says, oh, yeah, we've done lots of clean rooms, because I've got a great story about that where a project recently on the West Coast, the architect says, yeah, we've done lots of clean rooms. Don't worry there. And then when I got to looking at their construction drawings on the door schedule, they had mahogany or wood. There was some sort of wood door. I'm like, we would never put wood doors. I don't care if you think you've sealed it or not. We would never put. So the architect saying, oh, yeah, we've done lots of this. And they had an extruded storefront glass window with extra ledges. Well, USP 797 wants us to have minimal ledges. I'm thinking to myself, okay, and I'm not just beating them on architects, because this could be GCs and or engineers as well. Oh, I've done lots of those. Okay, great. I still want somebody to double check your work, just because it's not that I don't trust you, but I can't really trust you. You got to understand, we're making injectable drugs that are going to go in people's bodies here. There's no wiggle room for you to build me a shanty when I need it to be an ISO rated clean room. And I know I'm kind of being dismissive or humorous here, but that is the reality. So just because somebody on your project team says, oh, yeah, you've chosen the right firm, we've done a lot of those clean rooms, please have somebody on your team to double check. Please.
Yeah. And I would say that it's very important to find not just those companies that say they've done some, but really that have a demonstrated expertise in this area, because it is a completely different type of project than many other building projects, many other architectural type projects. So I would think that you really need to vet those professionals and make sure that they have a demonstrated history of working on these types of projects. That makes your life easier, right, Bryan?
Absolutely. Yeah. I love how you phrase that. Yeah. A demonstrated capability.
Yeah.
Show me some projects. Let me talk with some clients. Give me somebody, even for me, if somebody says, well, Bryan, do you have past clients that I can talk to? Absolutely. I would 100% open up my clientele roster, say, call them and just see. And a GC, an architect should do exactly the same.
Right. Fantastic. Well, Bryan, this has been a great conversation. Definitely appreciate you spending the time with us today. And I want to thank you for being here and sharing your expertise.
It's certainly my pleasure. Thank you for having me, Stacey.
Of course. Also, a big shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen. And most importantly, thank you to you, our valued listeners. We're grateful that so many of you spend time listening each week, and we hope that you continue to share this podcast. And don't forget to send us your ideas and guest suggestions. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe in your podcast player of choice, and be sure to share with your friends, colleagues, and online networks so they can enjoy it too. Plus, send us a quick note or leave an online review. We'd love to share your feedback with our network. For show notes and additional podcast resources, including links to the USP 800 regulatory information, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com/podcast. We'll be back again next week with another informative and thought-provoking discussion. Until then, make it a great week.